Echo Knight is a pretty interesting point and click style adventure game that you control in the first person. It's basically an FPS without shooting. It's an FPS for the refined gentleman. You won't find any guns or demons to kill in this game. Well, actually, there are demons and ghosts in the game, but you're not shooting them with a gun. You're like solving puzzles and you're trying to find objects, and then you're using objects with other objects. It's very much the prototypical point-and-click adventure game, but it has a really nice setting. It has this great art style. It takes place in like the early to mid 20th century. The game has a good atmosphere and feel. It feels actually not so much like a game, but like watching one of those mystery television shows on like PBS or like BBC Five. Or even better, it's like reading a book, like reading a suspenseful horror mystery. It's actually very much like reading a book because of how slow paced this game is. It feels like you're turning pages rather than actually participating in action. A lot of the game, well, pretty much all of the game, is probably a little too slow paced for most gamers who are just high on Ritalin and need to be ripping off demon heads every 30 seconds or they're going to throw their controller through the TV. This is a game for people with a more refined taste. And even people who like point and click adventure games might not like this game. You also have to be like in the right mood. I think the best time to play this game is like in the evening with the lights turned off. And not because it's really a scary game. I mean, it has scary elements, but just because of how slow paced it is, you never feel like you're in danger. It's not jump scares. It's more just you don't know what's going on and there's scary elements. It's also a Japanese game, so you know the horror elements are incredibly weird, sometimes a little too weird, and you don't know what's going on most of the time. Like I said, you walk around solving a few puzzles, finding a few things and using them with other things like interacting with the environment, and some of the other things you do is come up to ghosts which kind of sucks you into the past, into their story to find out why they're a lost soul, a lost ghost or something, and you have to like fix their life, and then they are able to ascend into the next life or whatever. It's just a cluster of horror narratives, and because it's Japanese, it's often poorly put together. A lot of it is just weird for the sake of being weird, but what saves the game is the great atmosphere and feel. Just walking around the game is a pleasurable experience. It's like the video game equivalent of ASMR. But how would Echo Knight compare with other point-and-click adventure games? Let's take three that I've reviewed in the past. Let's start with something like The Longest Journey. Now, if you've seen my review of The Longest Journey, there's a reason I called it the best games ever, whatever I titled that video. The Longest Journey is the or one of the best point and click adventure games of all time. It has this great sci-fi and fantasy setting. It's really fun to play, but what's hard about that game is a lot of times you really don't know what to do or where to go. A lot of the parts in The Longest Journey I had to give up and give in and actually go online and look through a walkthrough or a guide to see what I have to do next. So there's a lot of parts of The Longest Journey that I absolutely love, and a lot of parts that just left me dumbfounded, and I had to like go out of my way and basically cheat to find out how to play the game. There are definitely hard parts in Echo Knight. I'm not going to lie to you. There's confusing parts, especially since it is a Japanese horror. Most of the confusing parts are in the story. In terms of finding out what you have to do next or where to go, this game has that, like pretty much all point and click adventure games from the 90s, but not as much as The Longest Journey. That's probably the only place where this game is better than The Longest Journey. It's a lot less confusing, a little less hard, but pretty much everywhere else The Longest Journey beats this game out. Like the setting, The Longest Journey has a way better setting, which only really says how good the setting and the feel of The Longest Journey is, because as I've mentioned, I love the setting of this game. This early to mid 20th century feel, rusted buildings, foggy nights, old school trains. It's awesome. It's like you're in a made for TV BBC movie, but it's just not quite as good as The Longest Journey. Now let's take a look at another adventure game that I've reviewed, Valiant Hearts: The Great War. I believe I reviewed this about 2 or 3 years ago. It's a 2D adventure game, and it's basically like an adventure game. It takes place kind of like in the same time period as this game, but Valiant Hearts takes place around World War One. In that game, it had great graphics, even though it's 2D. And you just walked around solving puzzles and using things with other things or finding objects to progress. That game had a really great story. I think Valiant Hearts definitely beats this game in the story and the fact that the puzzles were a lot better. The puzzles in Valiant Hearts were very good. Like a lot of them were as good as puzzles in like Portal or Portal 2. Valiant Hearts is definitely an adventure game that really shined when it came to the puzzle elements. Again, I think Valiant Hearts would also beat this game out in terms of which one is better. Although I think the feel of this game is better, even though it's not quite as good as Valiant Hearts. The just that mid to early 20th century feel, it's just a great setting. I cannot praise this game's setting enough. And I think the last game I would like to compare to this game would be an adventure game called The Wolf Among Us. Now, The Wolf Among Us is an adventure game that's a little later. I believe it came out just a few years ago. And that was a very good adventure game. Why? Because it's from Telltale. Do I even need to explain that it's a good adventure game? I mean, it has the Telltale stamp of approval. Do I need to go on? Oh, Telltale game? Automatically greatest adventure game of all time. Though I shouldn't even continue talking about it. But The Wolf Among Us was basically an adventure game where they took various fable stories, about the big bad wolf, about Little Red Riding Hood, all those types of stories for children, like Hans Christian Andersen type stories. And it turns out all the characters from those stories are real, and they're living in like these slums. They're living in Skid Row in the middle of a big city. I think it was Manhattan or something. I don't remember. But the point is, the characters, they try to basically take characters from fables and humanize them, make them like struggling prostitutes and addicts and whatever, give them human problems, and then you play as the big bad wolf, from the Little Red Riding Hood, basically, and he's now no longer a bad guy. He's a detective. Now, this might sound weird, but the story was definitely a little less weird than the story in this game, believe it or not, which again just shows how weird the story is in this game. What I liked about that game, The Wolf Among Us, is again great characters, great dialogue options, but it was a pretty simple game. Like there wasn't your typical point and click adventure game confusion. And that's probably because it was a later point and click adventure game. The later adventure games, like adventure games made after like 2005 or 6, they're not as confusing and as difficult as adventure games from the 90s. That's probably just why. But that's also kind of a bad thing, at least compared to this game, because this game requires a little investigatory work, a little thinking. The Wolf Among Us, virtually no thinking. There were some parts where you had to find something and use it with something else, but whatever you had to find was right in front of you. Any kind of on the spot thinking you had to do was pretty obvious. So The Wolf Among Us, while it's probably a little bit better than this adventure game, just because overall it's better, the one thing that it lacks would be the difficulty of this game, which can be a little more difficult. Where is this game difficult? Where, aside from the things I mentioned, some of the objects you need to find aren't right in front of you. So you really have to think. Like sometimes you're going to walk around the whole place looking for something. You don't know where that thing is, but it's right in front of you, yet it's not in front of you, like under a table. Some things are like right next to you, but you won't even think to look there just because it's not something that's even in your mind. You don't even think that you could put something under a table in an adventure game, because every other adventure game you've ever played, it was always under a book on top of the table. You never left that three-dimensional table space where you could actually put things in the fourth dimension under the table and confuse the audience. So, yeah, I guess all three of the games I mentioned are slightly better than this adventure game, which isn't necessarily saying this is a bad adventure game because it's not. It's just that those are a little bit better, and they are. Those are great adventure games. Echo Knights, despite its several flaws and confusing aspects, it's a good adventure game. It's an acquired taste, but I would recommend it if you're in the mood for something unique, strange, that has a good feel and setting. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more classic game reviews. Goodbye, my friends.